I hope you all had a wonderful spring break, and I suspect you did not spoil your pleasure in a week off by exploring the mysteries of competitive markets. To get everybody back in the mood, let's watch this little competition from our favorite duopoly, Coke and Pepsi. And now to drag you back to the realities of school and this course. Tomorrow you will take 2 quizzes on market structure and profit maximization. These quizzes are going to look a lot like the practice quiz I posted before the break and the practice quiz I posted during the break, both of which you'll have a chance to take or retake today with a partner. Before I turn you loose on your computers, though, I want to review some of the material from my last podcast. Let's start with market structure. While these 5 terms sound precise, they aren't really. What we're looking at is a continuum with firms having very little market power in perfect competition and a lot more, but not absolute market power in a monopoly. We're mostly going to focus on perfectly competitive markets. In these markets, there are lots of buyers and sellers. Products are identical or close to identical. In other words, sellers do not compete by claiming that their product is somehow superior. It's relatively easy for firms to enter these markets, and one firm is too small relative to the market to affect the price. To put this another way, producers in competitive markets are price takers. If you recognize these images, yep, I stole them from the market structure video that I recommended and posted on Moodle. I still recommend it. In monopolies, at the opposite end of the spectrum, one firm is the industry and has much greater market power. It produces a unique product for which there aren't any substitutes, and there are high barriers to entry. Throughout history, most monopolies have been created by governments. So, for example, Queen Elizabeth I got into trouble with Parliament for granting monopolies over the sale of certain items to her supporters. One example, interestingly enough, was playing cards, which is why I inserted that into the painting. So-called natural monopolies occur when it only makes economic sense to have one firm in an industry. The classic example used to be long-distance telephone lines. Why invest huge sums necessary to string 2 sets of wires along the highway? The government actually broke up that monopoly by requiring AT&T to allow competing companies to use its wires. That brought down the cost a lot, and then cell phones delivered a death knell to the telephone monopoly, or death blow. And that's usually the way natural monopolies die, a natural death. Monopolists can force prices higher and earn more profits than they would in a competitive industry. I'll talk more about that in my lecture on Wednesday. That tempts competitors to figure out a way around the monopoly and a way toward those profits. This is actually the market structure you encounter most often as a consumer. In this kind of market, there are lots of firms and they produce quite similar products, but they don't want to compete on price alone. So they try to use marketing to differentiate their products. I've used sneakers as an example. Oligopolies are characterized by a smaller number of producers who often try to exert market power by agreeing to limit supply and therefore raise prices. The problem, as we saw when you tried to preserve a jelly bean cartel, is that there is a strong incentive to cheat. If everybody else follows the rules and keeps quantities low to raise the price, and if you don't reduce your quantities but still reap the benefit from the higher price, well, you win for a little while until everyone else decides to cheat too, which is why OPEC has not had that much long-term success restricting quantities and keeping prices high. Instead, they've had a steady stream of Middle Eastern wars to disrupt the supply and raise the price instead. Until, that is, a technology workaround upended the supply and suddenly restored the United States' position as a leading energy producer. Do you know what that technology was? Fracking. And yes, it's controversial, but it's a major reason you're now paying a whole lot less at the pump, and we'll take this topic up later in the week. Other oligopolies occur when there are high barriers to entry and major economies of scale, when it makes sense for a few large producers to dominate the market. Auto companies are often given as an example, although in fact they operate in a pretty competitive market. A duopoly is a monopoly with 2 dominant members. What's key is that in these market structures, each producer has a large enough chunk of the market to have some ability to affect price. In other words, it has market power. Okay, back to graphs and problem sets. You now know that a firm supply curve is actually its marginal cost curve. Market supply is simply the sum or addition of all the individual marginal cost or supply curves. What's important to note here is that firms do not necessarily have the same cost structure. Some are more efficient than others. All firms will produce at the profit maximizing rate where marginal cost, which is the cost of producing the next unit, equals marginal revenue, which is the amount of revenue a firm receives from selling the next unit. But since firms have different marginal costs, they will have different profit maximizing rates of production. So here we see that if the market price is $1.50, producer A will produce about 5 units of output, while producer B will produce about 2 units of output. Together, they produce 7 units of output, more or less. Remember that in a perfectly competitive market, marginal revenue is the same as market price. This graph just makes the same point. Supply and demand determine the equilibrium price, the demand for an entire market, but any individual firm has a demand curve that is simply a horizontal line at that equilibrium market price. So let's take a look at the kind of chart you'll encounter in your problem quiz. This shows market demand and market supply for a product I've nicknamed Goop. Market demand curves are also the sum of individual demand curves, but we're not worrying about individual demand right now. So, based on this chart, what is the market price for Goop? This should be easy review from Unit 1. Market price and quantity are established at the point where supply equals demand, right? So for Goop, at least at this moment in time, the market price is $3, and at that price, suppliers will produce and sell 2 million pounds of Goop. That's the entire market. But now we're going to go back and look at an individual Goop producer. You've seen this table before on your practice quiz. Now that you know that the market price is $3, I think I gave a different market price on the practice quiz. How much Goop will this individual Goop firm produce? Remember, you're looking for the production point at which marginal cost equals price, in this case, $3. So here's the same chart with marginal cost filled in. You know how to calculate marginal cost, right? It's just the amount that cost goes up with each new unit of output, in this case, pound per minute. So what is the profit maximizing production quantity? It's 4 pounds per minute, because that is the point where marginal cost is $3 equaling price, or marginal revenue, also $3. So let me pause for a warning. Note, these problems build sequentially. So if you get the market price wrong, or if you calculate marginal cost wrong, you get all the rest of the questions wrong. So be careful and check your answers. You can use the information about market price and total and marginal cost to calculate total revenue, average total cost, profit per unit, and total profit at the profit maximizing point of production. Remember, you need to get that part right. Do not lose sight of it. So we now know that the market price is $3 and the profit maximizing point of production, where marginal cost also equals $3, is $4 per minute. So total revenue is price times quantity, or 3 times a quantity of 4, or 12. Average total cost is total cost, or $8 divided by 4 units. That's $2 per pound. Profit per unit is the price minus the cost per unit, or the average total cost minus the price. So we have a $3 price minus a $2 average cost, which equals a $1 profit per unit. Total profit is profit per unit times the total number of units, or, I think this is often easier, just total revenue minus total cost. You can calculate it either way to get a total profit of $4 per minute. If you're confused about this, and I realize it went by pretty fast, then working through the practice quizzes should help. Here's a very similar exercise, only this time we're extracting the information from a graph instead of a chart. These graphs show a competitive market for radishes. Note that it fits the criteria, the radish market does, that is, many sellers, largely undifferentiated product, low barriers to entry. Did you ever plant radish seeds as a kid? It may be the very easiest vegetable to grow from seed. I remember helping my toddlers plant radish seeds so they could see how quickly they sprouted. So let's take a look at the market for radishes while firms are still earning an economic profit, and therefore new firms would be tempted to enter the market. That supply curve is represented by curve S1. What is the market price and quantity? Note that these figures are millions of pounds per month. So the equilibrium price, according to this graph, is 40 cents, and the equilibrium market quantity is 10 million pounds a month. Next, let's move over to the right panel to look at an individual radish producer. At what production quantity does marginal cost equal marginal revenue or price, since it's a perfectly competitive market? The graph conveniently includes a label. This producer will produce 6,700 radishes per month. What's the average total cost at this production point? This time the labeling could confuse you, but average total cost is 26 cents. So the profit per unit is 40 cents, the price, minus 26 cents, the average total cost, so profit per unit is 14 cents. Total profit is 0.14, 14 cents in decimal form, times the quantity of 6,700, or 938. What makes this graph a little confusing is the 22 cents, which actually represents the lowest possible average total cost. Let's return to that in a minute. But first, here we see what happens when too many firms enter the market. This graph unhelpfully does not include numbers, but again, we see that an increase in supply and with it a lowering of prices has brought the price from P2 to P1. So price comes in well below average total cost at this new equilibrium. The loss per unit is represented by C1 minus P1, and total loss is that shaded green rectangle. With losses like these, firms will exit the market. Supply will decrease or shift back to the left, and prices will rise again. So now we're back to the first graph, but this time let's look at the long-term equilibrium supply, which is represented by S2 on this graph. So how do we know that this is a long-term equilibrium, at least assuming that all firms have the same cost structure, which they probably wouldn't? Well, the production point, as always, is the point where price or marginal revenue equals marginal cost. I hope that's really getting into the hard drive. But now these two meet at the point where average total costs are also at their lowest possible. In other words, the point where price equals marginal cost equals average total cost, which is the point of long-term competitive equilibrium. On this graph, all three, price, marginal cost, and average total cost, are 22 cents. Now we see where that 22 cents came from. In my first Competitive Markets podcast, I told you that in perfectly competitive markets, all economic profits disappear. That's actually a little confusing. A less confusing way of saying the same thing might be that abnormal profits disappear. And what do I mean by this? So do you remember the difference between economic and accounting costs? Economic costs include opportunity costs, and they're included in economic profit. So a market in perfect long-term competitive equilibrium will still have accounting profits. It will still be in the black. But some of those accounting profits are return on investment to owners. If the owners did not get some return, in the case of a farm, if the farmer didn't get some income, then the farmer would be better off working somewhere else, or investors would be better off putting their money somewhere else. In other words, a market in long-term competitive equilibrium is just meeting these opportunity costs. This means that society's resources are being employed in the best possible way, given producer costs and consumer demands, or given supply and demand. I think it may be easier to understand this if I give away the answer to one of your quiz questions from tomorrow. What happens when economic losses exist in the potato chip market? That is, if price falls below marginal cost for at least some producers. So you see your choices here. Well, one of the many benefits of competition is that it redirects resources from lower to higher value uses. A price below marginal cost signals that too many resources are being used to produce potato chips. These resources would be better deployed producing other goods with a higher value to consumers. Anyway, if losses are occurring in a perfectly competitive market, that means that too many, not too few firms are trying to compete in the industry. So right away, you learn that all of the above is not going to be the correct answer. Economic losses also mean that society's resources are not being used optimally, given consumer demand for potato chips. Society would be better off if some of those potato chip producers started making, say, corn chips or baked kale chips, if consumers are now putting a higher value on healthy stuff. And that's really just another way of stating the correct answer. The goods and services that society is giving up are more valuable than the potato chips being produced if economic losses exist in the potato chip market. Well, I'm going to return to market structure, market power, and cartels on Wednesday and Thursday after you take the 2 competitive market quizzes and after you begin and ideally complete a reading quiz on an actual perfectly competitive market, corn. In the time remaining today, you should take and if necessary retake the 2 posted practice quizzes. Tomorrow's 2-part quiz will look a whole lot like these practice quizzes. The quizzes are set up for immediate feedback so you can check your answer before you move forward and read my explanation about the correct answer. If time permits, you can start on a reading quiz based on this Department of Agriculture report on the structure of corn markets. Yes, I realize it's pretty old. It's a 2006 report based on 2001 data. I didn't find anything more recent that I liked better. The rather similar report on catfish farming that I used in my last podcast is actually even older. And I don't think corn markets have changed all that much in intervening years. Corn is an almost perfect example of a perfectly competitive market. There are multiple producers, more than 400,000 according to more recent data from the U.S. government. Prices are determined by a worldwide market governed by a highly efficient commodities exchange based in Chicago, where prices change by the second as supply and demand conditions shift. Corn is also a largely undifferentiated product. You don't know if you're consuming old McDonald's or young McDonald's corn. And finally, corn has relatively low barriers to entry, especially for producers who already own land. But corn farmers are not all created equal. They own different amounts of acreage, they employ different equipment, they have different levels of education and training, they farm, this turns out to be very important, in different places. And this translates into different cost structures and different profits. And that's what you'll be exploring as you read this report and answer the questions. It's a long document, and I really don't expect you to read through it word by word. The quiz questions will help guide you where to look. I basically put the page number where the answer can be found. And I will leave this exercise open for a week until Monday, April 20th. I will not set a time limit on completion, but I strongly encourage you to work with a partner or a group. Again, tomorrow you will take 2 competitive market quizzes and then have the rest of the time in class to work on this exercise. Let me mention one more resource that I've placed on Moodle. This funny-looking guy has posted a series of review videos on economics concepts. I've posted 3. 1 chart-based and 2 graph-based lectures on short and long-term competitive markets. If after doing the practice quizzes you're still feeling confused, you might give these a try. They're short, and I thought they were quite clear. Hang in there. After a brief foray into cartels, we will turn to labor markets and how you can get a raise.